Hi guys. Now today we're going to concentrate on a soliloquy from Othello. So the soliloquy is Iago's one from Act 1, Scene 3. So just focusing on some dramatic terms first and foremost. Remember, of course, that we have dialogue in a play and stage directions. Dialogue is just conversation, okay, just on a very basic level. Then we have a duologue, which essentially is a conversation between two people. Duo, think two. Then we have a monologue, which is a speech, of course, delivered by one particular character. But the character may be addressing, of course, other characters on stage. And there we have the difference between a monologue and a soliloquy. So remember that soliloquy comes from the Latin solus, meaning alone. Okay, think of solitude and so on. A lot of these words have the same root word. So the idea, of course, is that the character is alone on stage thinking aloud. So only the audience then can hear what the character is actually saying. There are no other characters who are privy to what he or she is saying. And remember, we were looking at that when we focused on Hamlet. Okay, so remember we also have a little aside. Aside is usually quite short, one or two lines, could be a little bit longer, like a mini soliloquy essentially. So a character will just simply turn to one side usually and just say, it's almost like muttering something out the side of your mouth. Or sometimes, of course, a character will turn directly to the audience and address the group, the audience as such, who's seated there watching the play. So think about soliloquy as such. What kind of function or purpose does it have? Very simply, it is a private speech. So the character, as I said, is usually alone on stage. It also expresses innermost thoughts, so the kind of private thoughts, ideas, opinions, and feelings of the character. So if you think about it, usually in a novel, then that would be the first person narrator, or you could have a letter or a diary entry. And then when it comes to a film or a TV show, you have a voiceover. So it's quite intimate then. And it's very important that Iago has a number of soliloquies in this particular play because he's always acting or dissembling. He's always pretending to be the loyal character, the loyal friend. But the reality is that he's plotting and scheming to undermine and kill the other characters. Okay, so it reveals then innermost thoughts, opinions, and feelings. It also then, of course, and this is very important in terms of Iago, it outlines or elucidates, it highlights the motivation of the character, because we're left kind of puzzled really throughout the play as to why Iago does what he does. He can't just be motivated by money, can he? It's not just a game to him. Does he really despise these particular characters in particular or specifically Othello as such? I mean, what has Othello done to him? He promoted somebody else. Is it worth all of this carnage, all of this plotting and bloodshed and suffering as such? So the soliloquy is very important in helping us to understand then Iago's motivation. And we have to think about what he reveals to us. Is he being truthful, of course, to us, the audience? Is he being truthful to himself? Okay, it also, just on a very basic level then, indicates future plans and plots. So we're able to keep up to date then with what Iago has planned. Now remember, of course, Iago is a very opportunistic character, so he can seize the moment and use that to his advantage, rather like Edmund in King Lear. But we need to be able to keep track of Iago's plans. And think about this particular play, Iago actually has 7 different soliloquies and lots of little asides as well, whereas Othello has only 3. So when you think about it, Othello is exactly who he appears to be. He's very upfront, he's very direct, he's a very straightforward man. Iago is the opposite. So they are contrasting characters or foils then as well. Obviously, when we're reading a soliloquy or we're listening to it, it would suggest the different characteristics of that particular character, the traits or attributes then. Okay, so we get to know the character very well. And then maybe it also highlights characteristics when it comes to other characters in the play. Maybe it gives us more information in terms of that particular speaker and his relationship then with other characters. It can also reveal important plot details that we weren't aware of. So just in terms of the function of the soliloquy, that's a very obvious one then. So revealing plot or aspects of the story that are very important that perhaps we haven't heard about before. That could relate back to motivation, and it could also relate back to future plans or intentions as well. So essentially then it reveals the truth about the character's mindscape. Okay, it's quite confidential and intimate and personal then, and it offers key information about the character's relationships, and it helps us to understand motivation and intention. Okay, so all of that is very important. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to have a look then at Act 1, Scene 3, just that short speech towards the end, that soliloquy by Iago. Now, what I've done is I've sent you two different versions from YouTube. One is a black and white version. It's actually Monna's only about, I think about 10 years old. And the other one then is Kenneth Branagh playing Iago in a version of Othello that was made back in the 1990s. Okay, so Lawrence Fishburne plays Othello, and then Kenneth Branagh, of course, very acclaimed Shakespearean actor, has won Oscars and so on as well for playing Shakespearean roles, plays Iago. Okay, so it's two kind of very different interpretations, but as you're reading through the soliloquy, think about how you would stage it as well. What would it actually look like on stage? Are you just going to plonk the character down center stage and have a spotlight trained on him? And essentially then, how are you going to make it more dramatic and more interesting? Okay, will you concentrate more on props and costume, music, lighting? How are you going to create a specific atmosphere here in terms of Iago alone on stage? Because think about it, Iago is supposed to be a very menacing character, quite a sinister character. And he gets away, of course, with his evil deeds for much of the play until he gets his comeuppance at the very end of the play. Okay, so the context then. Remember that Othello has now married Desdemona. They eloped, essentially. They got married in secret. Brabantio was told about this by Rodrigo and Iago at the beginning of the play, and he was absolutely outraged. So he summoned Othello then to the Senate and ordered him then to explain his behaviour. He accused him of witchcraft, and you can see, of course, the racism that came into play there. So Othello gave a good account of himself and emphasised that this was not a marriage of convenience, and he was not wishing to seduce Brabantio's daughter Desdemona. It was simply a marriage of real affection, intimacy and love. And Desdemona defended her husband in public as well, and said, of course, that she now owed her loyalty to Othello as her husband, not Brabantio as her father. Rodrigo was devastated by this, and he and Iago had a conversation in which he revealed to Iago then that he was going to drown himself, that he was going to kill himself. So we see how desperate he is. Iago manages to persuade him not to do that. Obviously, he doesn't care about Rodrigo. It's more about the fact, of course, that Rodrigo then wouldn't be able to pay Iago. So the whole point about Iago is, of course, that he's very cynical. It's all about the money, essentially, at this particular point of the play. And then we have other motives or motivations then as well. Okay, so Iago manages to convince Rodrigo to continue with this particular plan then to win the heart of Desdemona. And Iago then is alone on stage towards the end of Act 1, Scene 3. So he says, and it's almost like a sigh here, a kind of frustration, "Thus do I ever make my fool my purse." So he's emphasising his complete and utter contempt for Rodrigo. A minute ago, he's pretending to be Rodrigo's best friend, reassuring him, comforting him, and so on. So it really sort of emphasises how Machiavellian Iago is. Think back to the end justifies the means. He is utterly ruthless. He wants the money, so therefore he has to keep Rodrigo on side. But he despises him. He has no concern or consideration for him at all, simply denouncing him as a fool. So think about another word that you could use, or a synonym instead of fool: an imbecile, a buffoon, an idiot. Of course, it'd be a little bit more colloquial as well. "For I mine own gained knowledge should profane if I would time expend with such a snipe." And he's kind of emphasising the idea that he feels almost demeaned by the fact that he has to waste time with Rodrigo. But the only compensation, of course, is that he will get money in return. Now, a snipe, of course, is a particular bird. But if you think about to snipe, it can mean to sort of to annoy as well. Or think of a sniper, of course, to take pot shots. So that's a kind of different meanings here. But essentially, a snipe then is another word or a synonym for a buffoon or an imbecile again. So once more emphasizing his contempt then for the other character. And this is the key line then. For our time expended with such a snipe, but for my sport and profit. Think about it, 2 key words here. Sport, just for sheer enjoyment, for the hell of it, essentially. So he enjoys toying with people. He enjoys manipulating people. It's a game to him. So what does that suggest? It would suggest that he is ruthless, that he is cynical, as we've said before, but also that he's kind of sadistic as well. It's like tearing the wings off flies, essentially. It's all about just using and abusing people for pure entertainment purposes. So sport and profit, of course, it all boils down to money. So if you think about it, those are his key motivations, okay, for pure enjoyment and to be financially rewarded. Those are the 2 main reasons then, of course, that he spends his time or bothers with Rodrigo in the first place. Okay, then, and if you notice Kenneth Branagh's version here, there's a dramatic pause and the music becomes quite sinister as well. And he says, I hate the Moor. So this is really emphasizing then, of course, his complete and utter contempt for Othello. And it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he's done my office. So he's saying, of course, there are rumours circulating that Othello has slept with my wife, Emilia. Now, the next line is interesting because he says, I know not if it be true, but I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety. So he says, well, I've no proof, but I'll just accept that and I'll use that to motivate me as such. So in a way, he doesn't seem that bothered or concerned about the fact that Othello has slept with his wife. Obviously, that would be a blow to his pride as such then. You know, he would feel emasculated, less of a man. Because think about it, macho values are very important at that particular time and doubly important, of course, to Iago as well. It's all about appearance and image and reputation and so on too. That was why he was so angry then when Othello passed him over for promotion and promoted Michael Cassio instead. So it's almost a kind of an afterthought. He said, yeah, there are rumours abroad that he slept with Emilia. There's absolutely no proof whatsoever that Othello would do that. And we don't get the sense that Othello would behave like that either. Because after all, he regards Iago as his friend. And he's in love with Desdemona. So we don't really get a sense that he would. Maybe it happened a long time ago, but there's no real evidence or proof there as such. So in a way, he's kind of picking up on this rumour, or maybe he's just lying essentially to himself and everyone else in the audience, that this essentially then will be fuel then to add to the fire. It's another reason why I hate the Moor and why I have to seek my revenge as such. Okay, so that might tell you more about Iago, the man then as such here, rather than real motivation as such then too, that he can use anything at all, any little nitbit of information, any tiny piece of information, a fragment of information then just to strengthen his sense of determination then to get justice in his eyes and to seek revenge against Othello. So he says, he holds me well. In other words, that Othello respects me. So he knows that, but he's going to use that against Othello as well. The better shall my purpose work on him. So that's going to make it easier then for my plan to succeed. Cassio's a proper man. Proper means handsome. Remember, he had emphasized that at the very beginning of the play. So what he is doing is he notes, of course, or observes particular traits or features of other characters and then uses them against those characters. So we know, of course, that Othello can be a little bit, we'd say, naive and credulous and so on. So Iago is going to exploit that. And here he says, Cassio is a handsome man. So how is he going to use that in his plan then to undermine, obviously, Othello, but also Michael Cassio? Let me see now. So it's almost like we can see the cogs operating in his head. He's formulating a plan here. Remember, he's very good, I would say, structuring plans and plots and schemes. Think of the Machiavellian idea. But he's also very good, of course, at being spontaneous. He can seize on a particular piece or morsel of information throughout the play and then run with it, go with it and use it then to his advantage. So he says then, to get his place, in other words, his position, lieutenant, and to plume up my will in double knavery, and then, of course, to obviously bolster my plan. How? How will I do it? Let's see. So very important soliloquy because we're seeing the plan sort of being hatched then in front of our eyes. After such time to abuse Othello's ear that he is too familiar with his wife. So I'm going to suggest to Othello then that Michael Cassio is being too intimate, too flirtatious, perhaps too close with Desdemona. So basically he's going to play then on Othello's fears as an outsider. Okay, he's going to try and convince Othello that Desdemona and Michael Cassio have been flirting. Then it's going to develop into a full-blown affair. Then Othello's going to erupt in jealousy, and then we see the repercussions of that. So he continues to explain, he hath a person, i.e. he's handsome, and a smooth dispose. So he's quite, we'd say, not just flirtatious, but quite persuasive as such. He's quite charming. So women like him, women flock to him. To be suspected, everyone would believe that, because if he's handsome and charming, then they believe that Desdemona would fall for him. Framed to make women false. In other words, of course, he has that reputation then, of course, that every woman would fall for him. The Moor is of a free and open nature. This is very important. He understands that Othello is very honest, very sincere, very straightforward, and too trusting. He thinks men honest that but seem to be so. Now that in general, of course, means that he trusts people too easily, but very specifically it means that he trusts Iago too quickly and too easily as well. He's not a very suspicious sort of man. So basically he accepts people at face value. So he thinks men honest that but seem to be so. Think back to what Iago said at the very beginning of the play, I am not what I am. In other words, I am not what I appear to be. And that will be a key theme that we'll look at tomorrow as well. Think about the idea of appearance versus reality. People appear to be loyal and friendly, but they are the opposite. Now he uses an animal image. Remember we had that before, the black ram, the Barbary horse and so on. And will as tenderly be led by the nose as asses are. So he's using the image, of course, of a tethered or tied animal. It's the idea, of course, of an animal at a mart to be bought and sold, or the idea of a farmyard animal as well. So first of all, he's using the idea, if you think the ring through the nose and then you put, of course, the rope through it and you're able to move and manipulate the animal. So it's reinforcing the idea, of course, that Othello can be manipulated, that he can be exploited and used. It also emphasized the idea, of course, that he sees Othello as less than human. It's dehumanizing Othello again, using lots of animal images associated with him. And Othello had revealed to the Senate earlier that he had been kidnapped, essentially, that he'd been taken prisoner and that he had been sold into slavery. So I think that Iago is kind of emphasizing that particular point then as well, that he wouldn't even see Othello then as a real man, obviously because he's not white, and we see Othello, of course, as an outsider, and therefore Iago and Rodrigo, of course, is racist from the very beginning of the play. So tenderly here means easily. Will as tenderly be led by the nose as asses, easily controlled, essentially, is what he's saying. So like a donkey, essentially there. So he says, I have it. It is engendered. So this is the plan, or the plot has now been created. He now knows exactly what he's going to do. He's going to use Michael Cassio's innocent friendship with Desdemona against both of them by pretending that Michael Cassio and Desdemona are first of all flirting and then involved in an illicit affair. So the last part then of his soliloquy, hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light. Notice the use there of hell and night. Hell and night associated, of course, with diabolical images, of course, of the devil. Also associated with evil, wickedness, sinful behavior, corruption. And we begin to associate nighttime, of course, with Iago. Remember, we had that at the very beginning of the play where he was in conversation with Rodrigo on the street in Venice, walking along. It was a nighttime scene. So think about how the language and the imagery here relates back to the character in a very obvious way. So must bring this monstrous birth. The birth, of course, emphasized the idea of hatching a plan or a plot or a scheme. Think of machinations, the working of Iago's mind, and he has given birth to this diabolical plan then, of course, to take revenge on Othello. To the world's light then, it must come to fruition. I must reveal it then to the world. So he will put his plan in motion. Remember, it's very early on in the play. It's only Act 1, Scene 3, and we're getting a good insight then into Iago's character, his opinion of others, his motivation, and essentially, of course, what he intends to do. So it would be a good idea if you could just jot down your basic points then as you're actually reading through this, or as you're watching, of course, the two versions as well. And think about it, one of them is in black and white, and you could emphasize that that sort of reinforces the idea of good versus evil, literally white versus black, or if you think of Othello versus Iago, of course, in the play as well. And then think about how Kenneth Branagh uses the chessboard in his version then of this particular scene, and how that emphasizes the idea then of his motivation. Think back to the two key words, sport and profit. Sport, that is just a game, and that he then, of course, is the master manipulator or the master puppeteer, exploiting all of the other characters in the play to his own advantage. Until next time, guys, take care.